Namo Amituofo. I am Dharma Master Jing, and today I will start to share a series of stories which are the real experiences from worldwide reciters of the Buddha's name Namo Amituofo. And the first story is about a personal experience of a soldier. We call him Mr. A from Taiwan. We have to know that in Taiwan, all men have to serve the military for a period of time. So Mr. A was sent to a region to fulfill his duties. However, the place was known to have many deaths caused by the past war. Maybe because of this reason, Mr. A started to experience abnormal situation at night. He said that he could feel very clearly that there was someone disturbing him when he was sleeping. He could feel someone pulling his ear, hitting his back, or pulling his leg. But there was no one around. A bit scary, isn't it? How would we feel if this happened to us? It seemed like Mr. A was being disturbed by ghosts. Furthermore, this happened at night. But the scariest part was that Mr. A experienced these disturbances every night. If it only happened once or twice, we may explain that this was caused by his imagination or illusion. But this happened every night. So something must be wrong. Soon Mr. A felt very tired and desperate. Fortunately, there was a Buddhist officer in the army. After knowing Mr. A's condition, the officer immediately advised him to recite Namo Amituofo. The officer told him that when encountering with this type of matter we cannot resolve, we just try to recite the Buddha's name and we definitely will be blessed by Amitabha Buddha. At that time, Mr. A could only choose to believe in what the officer told him. So he tried to recite Namo Amituofo that night before sleeping. So what do you think of the effect? Do you think it can work by merely recite Namo Amituofo? The answer is yes, and the result were incredible because Mr. A was able to sleep soundly the whole night after reciting the Buddha's name. There was no issue of ghosts disturbing him at the night. Before that, it almost happened every day, but it was gone after the first day of recitation. So Mr. A started to believe in remarkable of Namo Amituofo Recitation. He even requested someone to buy him a string of prayer beads so that he was able to recite by counting the beads for a few rounds in the morning and evening every day. Until his discharge from the army, no more disturbances by the ghosts. The abnormal phenomenon ceased permanently. So this proven that the merit of Namo Amituofo Recitation are really inconceivable. We have to know that Mr. A was not a Buddhist initially, so he did not know who Amitabha Buddha is. And he wasn't a vegetarian as well. He only recited Namo Amituofo just because someone told him to do so. But you see, he is still able to receive blessing from the Buddha. So the Pure Land Buddhism teachings say, as long as we recite Namo Amituofo, the Buddha will bless us with all kinds of incredible benefits. It do not only secure a rebirth in the Pure Land, but also benefit us in this life, just like what Mr. A had experienced in the story. However, we also have to understand that sometimes the blessing may not happen in accordance with our knowledge. Just like in another part of the story, Mr. A related that once after the training, he returned to the army room to rest. However, at that time, out of nowhere, he felt very uncomfortable and could not rest well. So he chose to recite Namo Amituofo instead. He picked up his bead and walked outside his room while reciting. Suddenly, after walking away for a while, there was a huge explosion in his room side. This was caused by an accidental detonation of a bomb. The explosion totally destroyed his room. But fortunately, Mr. A escaped from this mishap as he was triggered to do his recitation outside his room. Let's try to recall the whole process. Initially, for no reason, Mr. A suddenly felt uncomfortable. He could not rest well and decided to go outside his room to recite Namo Amituofo. However, you see, this action helped him escaping from the deadly explosion. Therefore, Mr. A say, Amitabha Buddha blessings are so extraordinary. Because not able to sleep well may be torturing for normal people. But in his case, it turned out to be a blessing. So it's better for us to always recite Namo Amituofo and trust ourselves to the Amitabha Buddha. Amitabha Buddha is often called as the great compassionate father. He definitely will take good care of us. And the best part is that at the end of this life, you will be delivered by Amitabha Buddha to be reborn in the Pure Land. Then all suffering will surely come to an end and the eternal joy will fall upon us. Therefore, why don't we just recite the Buddha's name and trust ourselves to Amitabha Buddha? Alright, this is what I want to share for today. Thank you for watching and please feel free to visit our website for further information. Namo Amituofo.
Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo 阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛。
Please rise and put your palms together. May the merits from Amitabha Buddha be bestowed upon all sentient beings without discrimination. May all beings awaken to the Buddhi mind, be reborn in the land of bliss. Namo Amituofo.
Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo. Namo Amituofo.
仰靠阿弥陀佛愿力，人人念佛，人人往生，人人成佛。善导大师所开创的净土宗，是中国佛教8大宗派中影响最为广大、持久、深远的宗派，至今已如海纳百川，成为各宗共同的归宿。